Hello. Today we are going to be doing the Asian Readathon and AAPI month wrap-up. I read 4 full-length novels. I'm in the middle of one, and I read a few short stories. I'm trying to think of what order I want to go through these in. Maybe I'll start with the one I liked the most first because I want you guys all to read it. And that is The Making of Asian America by Erika. This is a nonfiction about the making of Asian America. So a caveat on that is that it really talks about mainly like South Asian and East Asian populations. So like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, people from the Philippines, people from India, Cambodia, Laos, a little bit of Vietnam, but it didn't, those were the main geographic areas it covered, so it's not like all-inclusive of like the entire continent of Asia. This is one of the books that you read and then you go, wow, my education was kind of trash, because I learned so much from this book that I'm like, why the hell didn't I learn that when I was growing up in school? Like, especially, I think, because I grew up in California, a lot of early immigration to the Americas of Asian people was into California. I grew up in the Bay Area near San Francisco, and the fact that we didn't learn these types of things, and there was just like, a week here and there where we learned about Angel Island just as a concept, is just baffling to me. So many of the places that were discussed in this book were places that, I know, like cities I'm familiar with. There's a lot of focus on California, but it's not the only focus. And I know I'm all over the place with this, so I apologize. But another thing is that this is like the making of Asian America, but there's some talk of Central America and Mexico specifically, and Canada. So I think that if you wanted to read this from those perspectives as well, you're still going to gain something from them. So I think that even if you're not American, it's still an interesting look at the globalization of anti-immigration. It does a good job breaking it up. So it talks about like kind of colonization. It talks about kind of like different waves of immigration. So one thing about this book is that it's not really totally in chronological order, which I get because this would be a very hard topic to talk about chronologically, because you're talking about a lot of different groups of people, a lot of different territory delineations, which change why and how people were able to immigrate into the United States and their actual experience within the United States because of social conditions, we'll say. So it goes through by like ethnicity and like country. So it talks about Chinese immigrants for one chapter, and then Japanese, and then Korean, and then Philippines, etc. I would get kind of confused because I think some of the timelines kind of overlapped, but I couldn't really tell. But I was listening to this on audio, so that might be part of the reason that I was getting a little bit confused. One of the things that I think this book teaches us is the cyclical patterns of xenophobia and immigration policy in America. So I did not know until I read this book that the first anti-immigration laws were passed against Chinese people in California, I believe. There would be a law passed, and then suddenly it would be harder for this group of people to be able to get into the country. And then a different population of people, Japanese people, would start coming into the country. And then, again, anti-immigration sentiment, and these people are taking our jobs. Doesn't that sound familiar? Really speaks to the pattern of xenophobia that we face. It doesn't matter where they're from. I mean, we're seeing a rise in anti-Asian violence now in America. And, it kind of also talks about how the model minority developed. The model minority sentiment does not exist for all Asian people, which this book also talks about. It does also talk about forced labor that occurred with Asian folks as well, which I didn't know about. I literally didn't know this stuff existed. It also talks about how, because of the anti-immigration policies that came into effect, then there began to be illegal immigrants in the country because of it.
Okay, so I just kind of want to clarify here that the book also talks about how by making anti-immigrant policy, that's what created the concept of being an illegal immigrant in a country.
These Asian people would come through the border of Mexico and America and through the border of Canada and America. It also talks a lot about how anti-immigrant policies were developing in the United States, and basically every time that we created a policy, Canada just was like doing it too. It was like US would put something in place, Canada would put that same thing in place, kind of back and forth, back and forth. It gives quotes from people's real life sentiments. It talks about like the demographics of people who are coming over. It talks about people coming in through Hawaii. It talks about the type of labor that people had. It talks about Japanese internment during World War II and how that was planned for a long time before Pearl Harbor was actually bombed. It talks about internment of people from Central America, Japanese immigrants and Japanese citizens of Central American countries being interned, sometimes being forcibly evacuated from their country and brought to the United States and being interned in the United States. And then once the war was over and the internment camps shut down, we're told that they came into the United States illegally. Like, I could talk about this book for days. I want to say it was baffling, but there were so many things in this book that happened now. There was talks about people being held at Angel Island at some point because anti-immigration policy started. Certain groups of people were being denied access, but they would be interned in these or kept in these camps, potentially for months at a time until they were denied. And sometimes they were sprayed down with herbicides, I believe, sprayed down with chemicals to disinfect, which we have also heard is allegedly happening in ICE camps now with other people. There was this big sentiment about Asian Americans and Asian immigrants taking jobs in agricultural work in California, and we hear the same thing today about people from Central and South America who come into America. It was enlightening about the making of Asian America. It was also enlightening to see history just repeat itself. I think the only other thing I want to say, which is a slight negative for me, is that it gave a lot of statistics, and this is just a pet peeve of mine. They talk about statistics of people and population sizes at different points in time. I wanted those numbers to be extrapolated to like what that would look like with the population size of the world now. The global population size and the American population size in the 30s was much different than it is today. So I wish it would have kind of given a comparison of what that means in like today's numbers, so that it was a bit more contextual. But that's just like a thing that I kind of feel about a lot of nonfiction I read, so just take that one with a grain of salt. But I have talked about that book forever. I think you should read it, and let's get on to the other ones.
Okay, I totally lied. Editing L here. I just wanted to say that I really talk about the immigration aspects of this book, but it also speaks a lot about the lived experience of Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in America. It also talks very briefly about our involvement in Vietnam and different conflicts that America has involved itself in Asia that has caused people to come either through immigration or as refugees into the United States. So I just wanted to clarify that this book is about a lot more than just the immigration aspects. Those were just the ones that really spoke to me.
That was the best book I read of the month. I didn't really like any of the books nearly as much. I'll go into the next nonfiction I read. I was really excited to read this. First They Killed My Father. In the previous book I talked about, The Making of Asian America, it does talk about the Cambodian genocide that occurred, and how a lot of people it affected the U.S. essentially because we were involved in Vietnam. We were kind of obviously part of the cause of this, and refugees came to America. So I wanted to read First They Killed My Father right after, because I thought it would be interesting to learn about that history, because I didn't know that happened, and then actually hear a perspective. If you're interested in reading that perspective, I think it's a good book to read. I listened to it on audio. I don't know if I would say it was a better or worse experience of the book. She talks about her life, kind of what it looked like before the Khmer Rouge came into power, and then what it looked like after. There's a lot of triggers. She ended up in forced labor camps. There's a lot of starvation, people dying, famine. There's a huge famine, multiple famines that happened during this time. She talks about being really starving as a child. This all started when she was 5. I always feel weird talking about memoirs, because I never want to discount someone's experience. And I feel like a lot of reviewers feel this way. You never want to discount someone's experience of something, and maybe because she felt more trauma, I do not want to discount this woman's lived experience. I don't want to discount the book. Maybe because she was young and this was a traumatic time, she just remembers it a lot more. And maybe I just have a bad memory. There was a lot of moments in the book, her being so young, she was, I don't know, maybe I'm just painting my experience on it. I had a hard time with her being 5 and really understanding the differences of wealth. Maybe it's just so apparent there when people's wealth is so different that's something you notice, and maybe I'm just being very what is the word? Entitled by saying that I wasn't able to perceive those differences at such a young age. I guess trauma kind of takes that away from you. So maybe we'll just pretend I didn't say all of that. The name of the book, First They Killed My Father, I think the name of it is a bit of a misnomer. There's a lot of events that occur before her dad died. I think it was a marketing thing. It's a really good name for it, and her father was kind of always in danger because he was a part of the old government that the Khmer Rouge overthrew, so he was in danger at all times. It's part of the reason they were moving around so much. It takes place over the course of all of that. I don't really think there's much else to say without getting into specifics of the book, but it's about her lived experience through that time. And so if that's something you're interested in reading, for sure go for it. I guess another issue I had with the book is that, and this is a personal preference thing, but it really just she was describing Cambodian traditions, very detailed, why Lunar New Year is important, and how birthdays are celebrated, things like that. And it was great information, but if you were Cambodian and you were reading this, you would already know that. So it definitely felt like it was written towards a Western audience. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. The author can do as she pleases, and it makes it more palatable a lot of the times, unfortunately, for Western people when books are catered towards them.
Okay, another thing I left out here is that I don't have a problem with the specific book. I have a problem with an industry and a global mindset, or a Western mindset, I should say, that tells people they should be writing books for someone else's gaze or for the white gaze.
I'm going to leave it at that. I don't really want to get into more detail. There's a big conversation you could have around this topic, but let's move on to the next book. So the next one is The Far Field by Madhuri Vijay. This takes place mainly in India and in Kashmir. I listened to this on audio, really enjoyed the audiobook, would recommend reading it via audio. This is one of those books that everything was there. And I was enjoying it. It was just that the pacing was off. And it's a book about many things. It's a book in 2 timelines. It's about this girl. She's in her 20s. She's kind of messy. I don't mean that in a mean way, but doesn't have her life together. She's out partying all the time with people she doesn't know. And it kind of stems from her mom's death. And she is just kind of not even trying to figure her life out, but something kind of prompts her to like have to push forward. And she goes to seek out this person that she knew from her childhood. So then we start getting flashbacks to that time. And it's flashbacks of her as a child interacting with her mother, interacting with this man who would come sell stuff to their door. It's a book about mother-daughter relationship. It is not perfect. It is very messy. Her mother has obvious underlying mental health conditions that are never really discussed actively on the page. And it doesn't really feel like anyone's totally seeking help for her for those things. But she is obviously unwell, which is part of the reason there's such a tumultuous relationship between the two of them, especially in the daughter's head. You see a lot of that in her mind, but she doesn't really articulate it to her mother, especially because she's a young child. And then the more present part of the book, she is kind of on a journey and she's kind of going from place to place. And that is always a tricky sell to me because she goes to a place and she's stagnant there for a while and she meets a cast of characters and you start to get to know them and she starts to get to know them. And then suddenly you're kind of ripped from that place and it's a bit jarring. And then you move on to the next place and the next thing happens again. But then all of the characters from the past are like forgotten in the context of the narrative. So I think if she had the author had sprinkled some allusions to those past places and past people a little bit more, it would have felt less jarring. But I think it's just a very difficult thing in general to write a narrative where you're moving geographically without it feeling like stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. There's a moment in this book that is represented on the cover of the mother-daughter relationship. I think that was really a really smart way of giving us a beautiful cover while still alluding to one of the main propulsions of the book. There is a lot of exploration of the politics of Kashmir. A lot of the Indian characters have opinions on people from Kashmir and the conflict that's going on there. I did not know anything about that before going into this book. One thing I really did not like about this book is the protagonist's relationship to male characters. It felt very forced that there had to be, if the man was not in a relationship, there had to be some like forced sexual chemistry between them. And I just felt that it was unnecessary for the narrative. Every time a man came up, I'm like, oh, here we go. She's going to have some sort of sexual chemistry with him, and that's going to be in here for some reason. But it never really, there was no purpose to that for me. Another thing, the ending. There was something hollow about it. I don't know how else to put it. I didn't like the ending all of that much. And that's all I'll say about this book. I wouldn't dissuade people from reading it. I thought it was good. I didn't think it was great. Okay, Kitty, oh my God. I also read This is Paradise by Kristiana Kahakauwila. These take place in Hawaii. The author herself is native Hawaiian. That really explores a lot of life on Hawaii, the dichotomy between that and tourism, the differences between natives and settlers of Hawaii, and like the dynamics of that type of relationship. A lot of the stories explore problematic relationships between couples. In all of them, one of the characters is native Hawaiian and the other character is either white or BIPOC, but not native Hawaiian. There's an interesting story about a woman who is native Hawaiian, but for a lot of her life, she grew up in America mainland, and she is in a relationship with a white man who grew up in Hawaii. And there's a lot of parts from his perspective of how she'll say, like, well, you're kind of a tourist. Like, she kind of refers to him as a tourist. and he's kind of offended by that. He's like, but I'm more of a local than you are. I thought that was a really interesting dynamic to look at. I really liked the first story in this. There's like the choral we that kind of is happening, like it's kind of speaking for all of these native Hawaiian women, and their interactions with this white tourist, and that's the one that's called This Is Paradise, and it's showing that it's obviously not completely a paradise. The second one, I don't remember the name, I'll post it here. It is about cockfighting, like fighting roosters, which is alluded to multiple times in the narratives of these. If that type of thing makes you uncomfortable, I would skip that one. It made me uncomfortable reading it. At the same time, I was trying to be mindful that there's cultural differences between myself and Native Hawaiians that I don't understand. But if you don't like violence towards animals in any capacity, if that's a trigger for you, just skip that one.
Another thing in the cockfighting story, the boyfriend of the protagonist, I guess, is indigenous to mainland America. And throughout the whole story, he is not ever referred to by his name. He is called the Indian. I didn't really understand why this was done from some indigenous voices I have listened to. Some people do not appreciate the use of the word Indian. So that's just something else to keep in mind.
I did quite enjoy the collection overall. I found the writing to be really powerful and beautiful. This is the first book I've ever read by someone who is native to Hawaii about Hawaii. So I appreciated that just in general, and I would recommend this to people, and I am looking forward to the next piece that this author puts out. So if you're into short story collections, I would recommend that. Just skip the second one if what I said is displeasing to you or would trigger you. I also did a 24-hour reading vlog where I listened to a bunch of Amazon short stories, and I made a puzzle, and I'll link that above. But I did read a few books by Asian authors. I'm not going to go through all of them. If you want to get my thoughts on them, I would recommend watching that. But I'll go through some of the ones I read. So I read The Best Girls by Min-Jin Lee, Parsnips in Love by Porochista Khakpour, The Contractors by Lisa Ko, and The Cleaners by Ken Liu. I read those about a month ago at this point, and the ones that really stick in my mind are Parsnips in Love and The Cleaners. I think The Cleaners, oh God, my foot's asleep. Oh God, oh man, okay. The Cleaners, falling apart. The Cleaners is about this idea of objects holding memories, and if you touch them, you feel all of the memories, especially your own, of that piece, and so you could get them cleaned and kind of wipe away those memories. Just conceptually, it was really interesting. Again, another really conceptually interesting one, Parsnips in Love. It is about a farmer in Iran, and he comes across this parsnip that looks like two people in a loving embrace, like they're making love. He found it to be really beautiful. It goes viral. It's just like about him and his relationship with his wife and how the world reacts to these parsnips in love. Those are all the books I read in May for the Asian Readathon and AAPI month. I want to link to a video I watched recently that I saw some people link to, just about reading diversely, kind of sometimes maybe seeming like a checklist. Like, hey, I'm involved in this diversity readathon, look at me, check mark, I'm doing my due diligence. But then when it comes to, things happening to people right now, and just using Asia as an example, anti-Asian violence and sentiments going on in America, things happening in Palestine, there's a discussion around booktubers, involving themselves in the reading of these things, but maybe not using their voice to bring light to these issues, or not putting like any money towards these things. I appreciate that conversation and the sentiment behind it. I don't really know how I want to incorporate that into how I run my channel, because I do think that these things are really important to know about, and I do like to keep myself informed, but this is the only social media account that we interact on. I don't have a Bookstagram. I don't really use Instagram. I don't use any other social media platforms at all. It's something that I'm thinking about. It's something that I've heard and I'm internalizing. I think that what I'm doing now is, I do care about these issues. I'm just rambling. I don't want to turn this into a thing. I just want to say I'm mindful of it. I don't want to tell you where to put your money. It's another part of this that makes me feel uncomfortable. I don't really want to talk about where I put my money, because I think that that's even more of like a check mark, look at what I'm doing type thing. So I just wanted to say that I have awareness around these things. I'm not reading in a bubble about this. I'm paying attention to things happening in the world, and I'll have some links in my description if you want to learn more, or there's anything you're passionate about that you feel like contributing to in any capacity. So that is all I got for this video. Let me know your thoughts on any of these books. Let me know your thoughts on what I just said, and until next time, happy reading.